teachers have to be on their toes to a high degree to be teachers in this present environment, because they're going to be challenged. Teachers have to keep growing. They can't just set themselves up and pretend to be permanently enlightened. They have to prove that through their trustworthiness and their responsiveness to the changing questions and needs of present-day seekers.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got a great show in store for today. We're going to be talking all about the student-teacher relationship, in particular, its relevancy in for the modern Western spiritual seeker. Here to chat with us today is Dr. Greg Bogart, who is a psychotherapist who integrates Jungian dream work, existential humanistic psychotherapy, yoga, meditation, psychosynthesis, and Buddhism. As well, he's a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Sonoma State University. He's an adjunct faculty member at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he's also a certified yoga teacher. And his book, In the Company of Sages, The Journey of the Spiritual Seeker, explores this very topic. So I'm really excited to have him on the show today. Greg, welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot.
So before we dive in, perhaps you could tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Well, when I was growing up in New York City in the 1970s, I was very affected by yoga and meditation from a young age. There were yogis in my neighborhood, and Swami Muktananda came to town and was 2 blocks from my high school. So I really started practicing meditation at 14, 15, 16 years of age. And I also got very into Iyengar yoga at that time. So that's how my life's journey began. Also, I was a musician and still am a musician. And so those disciplines co-evolved as I eventually found ways to work with others as a counselor, as a teacher, and as an astrologer also. And I've continued to use all of these methods in my psychotherapy practice over the years. But also my path was very affected by connection with several important teachers who really had a lasting effect on me, very positive effect. But I learned a lot about some of the emotional dynamics of relating to spiritual guides. And that's how the book In the Company of Sages came to be written. Originally, it was a text for a yoga teacher training program because I wanted to address the process of becoming a yoga teacher at that time, but also how does it work on both sides for the student and the teacher? How can the relationship be mutually rewarding and catalytic?
Mm-hmm. And you use a phrase which I think is a really good starting point just to kind of talk about where you're coming from with all this of spiritual apprenticeship. Could you expand on that a little bit so we can get a sense of what that means to you and how you use that in this context?
Well, the idea is there's different levels of involvement with teachers, and some teachers evoke a profound devotion and commitment. Other teachers come into our lives and they pass on certain knowledge or techniques, practices that help us. And we wouldn't necessarily say we're disciples or devotees of such teachers, but we might feel that we're students or apprentices. We're in training. And like all apprentice-mentor relationships, there's a cycle of it. It doesn't last forever in the same form. The student eventually matures and grows up and is less of an apprentice and more an authority or a master in their own embodiment in their own life. So I like the term spiritual apprenticeship because it implies the process of seeking out something from a teacher or teachers, absorbing, integrating a way of life or practices, and consciousness, and then integrating that into one's own way of being, one's own life path. So it's not a permanent state of studenthood, let's put it like that.
Well, in your book, you lay out what you call the 9 stages of the student-teacher relationship, and I want to expand on that a little bit more. But before we do, to kind of flesh out even more what you were saying, how would you, especially today, given that it's a different environment in many ways than perhaps people over the past few thousand years might be interacting in their community with a teacher, with technology and all these other things, how would you differentiate between like a guru and a teacher or a guide or an instructor? Because I think those terms give even more clarity kind of to what you're talking about, of like, well, there's different levels and stages versus the especially when a lot of this wisdom started coming over from the East to the West. Everyone was out searching for a guru, and we can talk more about that idea later. But how do you place the importance of and the definition of these various kind of stages or levels of teachers in our lives?
Well, the idea of a guru comes out of India and Tibet and places like that, where there is a tradition of reverence towards people who, through a life of purity and purification and transformation, have evolved themselves in such a way that they affect others. Their presence, their influence, magnetically, vibrationally affects others who seek their company. And I think that remains true. Such a genuine guru is a rare person to run into. And a big part of the spiritual apprenticeship process is really our assessing a teacher. How evolved are they? How far can they take us? And I think one of the challenges is this tradition of the guru and the student or disciple. It came out of traditions that were much more respectful of tradition, and where questioning of authority was less a dominant principle. In America, we have our individualism, which is greatly challenged by the idea of devotion or surrender, or even unquestioning trust in a teacher. So we may make certain other demands of teachers. It's almost a slightly different process, I think, for Westerners, because we are so likely to question authority and be mistrustful, and also rebel against the idea of unquestioning devotion. So teachers have to be on their toes to a high degree to be teachers in this present environment, because they're going to be challenged. Teachers have to keep growing. They can't just set themselves up and pretend to be permanently enlightened. They have to prove that through their trustworthiness and their responsiveness to the changing questions and needs of present-day seekers.
And you make a really great point in your book, too, on this idea of surrender, not submission. And you even quote, I believe it's John Wellwood, saying it's mindful surrender versus mindless submission, which I think is a really good distinction, especially for the Western mind, to recognize that there is a difference between submitting to an authority and surrendering to something larger than yourself. I mean, most people, even in concepts like love, can get on board or understand this idea that, like, hey, when you're in love, you're putting someone else's needs in front of your own. You're opening up to something larger than your own concerns. And that's kind of what this idea of surrendering to a guru or a spiritual teacher is, that it's extremely valuable in life to experience what it's like to not always be putting your own ego first, because left unchecked, the ego itself is always going to convince you that it's the most important thing always, and that creates its own trouble along the path. If you wouldn't mind, before we even dive into the 9 stages, there's a really funny story in your book that I like, and perhaps you share it with us. It's the story of the sheik and the lamb's bladder. And we love stories on the show, so maybe if you could share that story with us, because I think it adds to this idea of, the teachers and the students relating in these different ways, where the student will test and the student will ask questions, other students will test, and where the teacher's playing that. Would you mind sharing that story with us?
Not at all. This was shared with me by my friend and teacher, Sangye Drolma, who was a beautiful woman, a Sufi teacher who also, she studied Tibetan Buddhism and Siddha Yoga and took women's pilgrimages to India, led them women's pilgrimages for many years. So this story comes from Drolma. Well, there was a seeker. The spiritual apprenticeship path begins with a search, a quest for someone who can inspire us on the spiritual path. A teacher whose presence is a living embodiment of radiance, of serenity, other expansive spiritual qualities. So it turns out there was this man who sought a sheikh, and he found a beautiful sheikh who sat by himself in a mosque, and he would go hang out in the mosque and just meditate with this sheikh, and there was no big following. And this is part of the process. We approach a teacher, we seek their company, and we sort of present ourselves. We say, okay, teach me. We make ourselves available. We may have to go through some hardships to make ourselves available to a teacher, but we'll pay the price. We'll travel the distance. We'll pay the tuition or the fee. So day after day, he's meditating, and he starts thinking to himself, God, my teacher, my sheikh, he's so beautiful. He's so graceful. He's so wise. His discourses are so lucid. I feel transformed in his company. It would be great if the world would discover my sheikh. He really deserves a wider following. So he had that thought. Well, the following day, he came back to the mosque, and there was a big hubbub. There were all kinds of crowds gathering. Television crews were there. CNN, The New Yorker, everybody was there to film and witness and see this phenomenal sheikh, this great mystic. Well, day after day, the student would go back, and the teacher was more and more distant, and he couldn't get anywhere close to him, and there were mobs of people coming every day. It's just a circus, a big media circus. Well, one day, the student was sitting in the back of the mosque feeling very sad and thought to himself, God, I'm just tired of this. I just wish all these people would go away and just leave me alone, just be me and my teacher again. That was his secret thought. He returned to the mosque the following day, and the mobs were there, the crowds were milling around, but there was a strange unrest in the air. People were chattering and saying there was something wrong. The sheikh smelled, he stunk horribly, and he was making these revolting farting noises. And people were thinking, this guy, he's gross, he's repulsive. And they started cursing and calling him a charlatan and hurling rotten fruit and tomatoes at the guy. And people started standing up and saying, why are we sitting around watching this revolting person? He's gross, let's get out of here. And so everybody pulled up and left. The cameras left. The interviewers left. And finally, the student was left standing in the back of the mosque, and it was just he and the sheikh. The sheikh walked over to him with a mischievous look in his eye, and he lifted up his robe, and under his robe was a lamb's bladder. It stunk horribly, abominable smell. And whenever he moved his arm, that the bladder was under his arm, under his robe, it would make these revolting farting sounds. And the sheikh smiled and said, I heard your thought. I responded to your wish. All of these people thought I was crazy, and they doubted me, and they took off. But you know me. You see my true being. So you weren't deterred, you weren't put off, you weren't scared away just because of what appeared to be my flaws. So that's how I know you're very worthy to have my company and be my student. And that's the story of the sheikh and the lamb's bladder. And it speaks to ways in which we test teachers, we check them out, and sometimes their behavior is a little bit perplexing or inscrutable and causes us to question their authenticity. And at the same time, teachers will test us. They'll test our character. So this is a story that talks about a kind of devotion that is beyond reason in a way, or beyond rational calculation, that he loved this teacher even though he appeared to be acting strangely and didn't meet people's expectations. And that's something that can happen with teachers. They may push it hard to test our trust in them. So the book delves a lot into this broad topic of crazy wisdom, which has been written about by Georg Forstein and others as a characteristic trend with some of the Eastern sages. And the book delves deeply into this question of, when do we trust a teacher? When they do things that seem out of character for an evolved person. Do we assess that they really are pretty flawed or narcissistic or vain or greedy or are abusing their power? Or do we feel a resonance with them that is not shaken even if they act strangely? Like there's the story of a guy who saw his spiritual teacher smoking a cigarette, and he was shocked. He was appalled. He thought that was horrible. But he realized that he loved his teacher even though he smoked cigarettes. And he was able to deal with that. Other people would find that unacceptable.
So where do, especially for the kind of challenging modern Western seeker, given all of the scandals and all the things that, especially that we're made more and more aware of because of media and news and all this stuff, where do we find that balance when someone is looking for a spiritual teacher you've got these crazy wisdom traditions where guys like, Drungpa Kunli who'd go up and step on a table in the middle of a restaurant and pull out his lingam and show it to everyone, like, look at my thunderbolt, and just wild things where there's that element. But there's also what's manipulation? I mean, what advice can you give, given both your research and your own personal experience, to people out there that's a genuine concern of am I being manipulated? Is this guy or gal a charlatan? Because there's a lot of that in the community, and I think that's created a resistance for a lot of people to really explore that realm of student-teacher relationship.
Well, there's a lot of pieces of this. Part of the reason this book was written was to validate this kind of perennial tradition of congregating around teachers or going to teachers to be initiated, to learn methods of self-transformation, and to experience deeper meditation in their company. And it has worked for me, and I believe that it is still a valid path. However, there are a lot of teachers who have given it a bad name, who have committed different forms of misconduct that gives the whole idea of a student-teacher relationship or the mystical guide or the guru, given that a kind of bad reputation, so that many people are mistrustful of it. But I feel like if you're on a spiritual path, you cannot be deterred so easily. You have to go and find someone who is worthy of your attention and your investment in them and in learning from them. And also, there's a process of accepting the flaws, the limitations, the humanity of teachers. That not all teachers are perfect. There may be a lot we can get from them, but they're not, perfect human beings. And I give one example. My Hatha yoga teacher in New York, Alan Bateman, is an amazing person and taught me so much. I will always be grateful to him to this day, after more than 40 years of studying his approach to yoga. But I see his flaws. I don't expect him to be other than he is. I don't have unrealistic expectations that I project on him. So that's one piece, is get what we can from teachers and know when it's time to move on, find a different teacher, or just be our own teacher. But the other thing is teachers need to keep evolving. And so many people in my life have been doing practices for 30, 40 years or more. They've been meditating or practicing yoga a long time, and some of those people have stepped into roles as teachers. And I think it's fantastic that there is so much more yoga and mindfulness meditation and Zen and different Buddhist practices and Sufi practices, and all these things are becoming more enlivening in our culture, and that there need to be new teachers to step in and keep that alive, keep that going. But what the teachers need to understand is they're under constant scrutiny. They have to keep working on not only their meditation and their state of consciousness, but their emotional presence, their ability to relate well to others, to be fair-minded, to not be squirrely and untrustworthy. So there's two sides of it. So I think that the traditional view was, the teacher is perfected, and you just try and find somebody perfect to be devoted to. And there are a few flawless, stainless, saintly beings who elicit profound gratitude in us. But it's also possible to learn from more what I call ordinary guides, helpful guides, and people just, a little farther along than us who can pass something on that lights us up. So in my book, I talk about different avenues this process takes. For some people, it's just get a little, training in a practice, a contemplative method, and go home and practice it, and then that's it. That's as far as it goes. For other people, it's a much more involved personal relationship with a spiritual teacher, where they may travel a great distance or make great sacrifices to be with the teacher and really surrender themselves in a profound way, and where there may be a practice that we call guru yoga, of deep inner attunement with a spiritual teacher who we feel to be capable of uplifting us, whose presence magnetically raises us and awakens us. And there are phases where that catapults us into our own realizations, our own expansions, our own awakening. So I address this as stage 6 of the process, glimpses of the goal.
Well, and one thing that I really appreciate about your insights throughout the book is that, you've made it clear that you do very much appreciate the path of a teacher, guru side of it, but you do really emphasize both the questioning side, that's not like a bad thing coming from a very much so a Western influence, where it's like, hey, we question things a lot more, which keeps the challenging the integrity of a teacher, which means as teachers, there's that constant need to, hey, you need to be checking and you need to be growing, which I think keeps us all so much more accountable. You've talked and mentioned, and so I think it's a great time. Obviously your whole book is fleshing out this concept and these stages that you work with, and you've mentioned bits and pieces here. Can you walk us through the 9 stages? Obviously you get so much more from your book, but just kind of quickly walk us through those 9 stages of the student-teacher relationship.
I'd love to. Stage 1 is called choosing a teacher. And we may hear the stories of teachers. We read Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda, or we read the teachings of Ramakrishna, or we read the story about Baba Ram Das meeting Maharaji. We are, excited to hear how others have been affected by different teachers, and we go about our own search for someone who can help us along. Just like if we want to learn French, we find a good French speaker to teach us, or if we want to be a good musician, we find someone who masters our instrument and can teach us to perform and play. So similarly, we seek a spiritual guide who has some admirable qualities that we emulate, that affect us. So we find the teacher that's right for us, not necessarily the teacher that everyone else is following or reading or pursuing, but the teacher who speaks to our present need. And we feel guided to teachers in different ways. And I tell my own story of the search for a teacher, which started when I was doing pranayama practices. I was doing Bhastrika pranayama when I was 16, and I felt this huge eruption of light in my brain and my head, and then I passed out. And it was quite frightening, actually, because I had roused some intense energy, but I didn't know what I was doing. I was doing it without supervision. And that's what really got me seeking a teacher. So there's a longing at this stage. There's an intense need to find guidance on the path. And so I tell some stories about that. And the inner feeling, the inner response that we feel towards some particular person through their words, through their example, through their demeanor, through just their mood, their state. So that's stage one. And I look at how spiritual teachers have been described and honored in Judaism, in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sufism, and basically say this is something that is found in pretty much all world religions and spiritual traditions, that there are teachers, there are wise sages who are exemplars. So stage two is approaching the teacher for initiation, approaching the teacher for acceptance, for transmission, to be accepted into the lineage that we're drawn to. And there may be a formal investiture of teachings, of energy, of mysteries. But I call initiation the kindling of spiritual life. I talk a lot about what's called Shaktipat, the awakening of the inner energy through an awakened teacher's presence. I talk about initiation in Sufism, which is beautiful. And we look into the whole idea of lineage, that we connect to an unending chain of beings who are lit up inwardly by meditation and devotion. So I talk about the idea of progressive initiations and the preparation, the inner readiness to receive initiation. It's something in us that calls it forth, that says, I want to intensify my process. So stage three is called discipleship, where we actually establish a spiritual practice, a change in our lifestyle. We build an inner fire through self-discipline, through changing what we eat, changing how we spend our time, changing how we direct our attention, changing the ideas, the teachings we drench our minds in. So discipleship means we get really into this process. We practice whatever our technique or our method or our path is on a consistent basis, and we start receiving the benefits of that, which is generally mental clarity, tranquility, forbearance, greater sense of love. And in discipleship, it's important to find something manageable. Some people get overwhelmed trying to do too many practices. They try and do everything, but then they can't really do it consistently. And even in Iyengar yoga, sometimes there's just so much meticulous detail, so many different practices, that to find a manageable discipline, is very important. My yoga teacher, Alan Bateman, taught me 20 things, 20 asanas and breath practices in 1979. And I did that for years and years. And I went back to him and I said, Alan, can you teach me something new, something different? Because I know there's a lot of variations out there. And he said, have you learned to do everything I taught you perfectly? Have you mastered everything I taught you so you can do them perfectly? And I had to admit, I couldn't do it perfectly. And he says, well, when you can do it all perfectly, then I'll teach you something else. And that was very helpful to me, because it gave focus to my practice, and I found it very nourishing to just try and get those 20 asanas and breath practices really well refined. Anyway, there's many facets of this, but we change our company. Sometimes we congregate around a spiritual community for a period of weeks, months, years, decades. We want to be around other seekers who are similarly inspired to practice whatever we do. Yoga and meditation happen to be my things, but whatever people love to do. And go deeper and deeper to follow the teacher's teachings, to put it into practice. This is discipleship. To seek the teacher's guidance when we have quandaries, when we have doubts. This is the beauty of spiritual apprenticeship, is we actually have someone we trust who can help us on our path. And I have had several people like that, and I still have several people like that now, that when I hit a certain stage or certain resistance or a certain obstacle, I can contact them, I can communicate, and they will help me. They will help me find more freedom. So we want personal contact with teachers at this stage and to get our questions answered. Some of it happens through what's called darshan, through just seeing the teacher, being inspired by their presence. And there's a lot to say about that that's fleshed out in the book about darshan. It's so beautiful just to see a great teacher. And that's at the heart of discipleship. Tapasya means that we do austerities. We generate a certain inner fiery transformation on a physical, emotional, and energetic level. And during the stage of discipleship, we experience gratitude and devotion for the knowledge we're receiving, the guidance we're receiving. So I talk about finding a community of practitioners and also risks of involvement in groups. And there I get into various aspects of cults and unhealthy groups like that make unreasonable demands and don't give you enough nutrition, and where they exercise practices of mind control. So there's various turns that it can take. I talk about false messiahs, and that's the thing. We're always the history of religions is full of stories of inspirational teachers, and then there's also teachers who have led people down an unfortunate path. And so, going into this process, one should know there are risks one has to be mindful of. And at some points, you may turn back. You may say, I don't want to be involved with this anymore. And sometimes you have to have the guts to do that and just say, this doesn't feel right to me anymore. Anyway, that's stage 3. Stage 4 is testing. And this is all seeking the refinement of the personality, where the teacher will really examine us. If you get close to a teacher for a while, they meditate on you, they examine you, they try to help you better yourself. And sometimes that means exposing things that are difficult to face. So testing is not easy. And then we have to go through tests of faith in the teacher. The teacher may ask us to do something that's challenging. They may ask us for a lot of money, or they may ask us to give up something. They may be fierce in different ways. And so that's where I get into the discussion of crazy wisdom versus abusive conduct. And how do you assess what is just crazy behavior, a wild mind of a Siddha guru, and what is unjustifiable, abusive conduct, and kind of unconsciousness in how a teacher treats people. And this sometimes stems from that tradition of unquestioning submission to authority that is seen in some Asian cultures. And this is described at length in the book, and referring in one case to the author Katie Butler, who talks about transcendental denial, where people may overlook misbehavior, misconduct of teachers because they believe the teacher couldn't possibly do anything wrong. And so they're in denial. That's not helpful. Sometimes teachers need to be called out, need to be confronted, because they're because that's the democracy that we want to live in, is that nobody is above scrutiny. And so it's a challenging path for the student and the teacher. The teacher has to stay on his or her toes and go to therapy or go to their own teacher and keep practicing and keep living well, so that they are worthy of the attention and the respect and the devotion of others. So testing of the student's character. Teachers will reveal different things like arrogance, fear, greed, and lust, different things that are impediments. So testing is where the relationship gets deeply personal. It's like we're really going deep into personal training. So I talk about how my big ego got exposed in my yoga ashram, and different stories of this kind. Stage 5 is really the heart of the mystery of spiritual apprenticeship. And it's called Grace and Guru Yoga, Receiving the Teacher's Spacious Gaze. And this is where we deliberately invite a level of merger, inward merger with the teacher's awakened mind, where we meditate on the teacher. This practice or practices have been recommended in the Yoga Sutras and in many aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, and also in Sufism. They have Guru Yoga practices. This is not a feature of all spiritual lineages, but in some cases, a teacher is a conduit for transmission. Some great teachers, a certain grace flows through them, and it is hard to explain that rationally. But when one has had that experience with a guide, it is beyond, it is incontrovertible. It is ineffable. It is not something that can be easily explained, but it is an inner certainty. That's what I experienced with my teacher, Muktananda. Phenomena, connection with him beyond space and time that cannot be rationally explained. And so gifts of the Spirit may result. And so this is where the general public has the most misunderstanding, or would tend to look askance at people devoted to gurus and meditating on their gurus. But there is a stage where it is profoundly uplifting to attune oneself to a teacher's state of consciousness. And I really learned this when I went to India when I was 20 to Ganeshpuri, and I really practiced this intensively. And you feel a sense of oneness with the teacher, and you realize that the guru is within. The guru is my own being, is my own inner self. And that brings us to stage 6, where we are at the threshold of our own awakening. And I give examples in the book of a number of people who, through years of practice, had breakthroughs into expanded consciousness. And that, after all, is the goal of all this, is to break through into the deeper, vaster potentials of our human nature. Stage 7 concerns separating from spiritual teachers. And this is the actual origin of the book, Ashton. The original the book started with a paper called Separating from a Spiritual Teacher. And that was published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology in 1992. And it was that chapter that I then expanded into the book.
And is that too where the phrase of the spiritual apprenticeship came from, leading of the fact that there is a separation, that there is, once you get your apprenticeship, then you move on. And again, you've got those final 2 stages, which is that embracing of your own inner teacher.
That is correct. So this section of the book on separating from a spiritual teacher is very involved, because emotionally it's complex. People can get into a place where they're very conflicted about leading a teacher? Is it okay for me to individuate? Am I ungrateful? Am I leaving because I'm angry at the teacher? Or am I just bored? There's different reasons, but we do reach a point where we've got to go and live our own life. I was lucky. My teacher, Muktananda, told me to go and live my own life. He told me to get out of there and go off and find myself. So I was really fortunate. There are other teachers who are more narcissistic, who are attached to the student, who try to keep everyone as satellites orbiting around them. They want to be the central sun. But a real teacher, a real mentor, wants you to excel, to exceed them, to go far beyond them. They want you to reach your heights and not be restricted, not be attached to them. So this is a profound stage of metamorphosis where one's own nature is unfolding in its own way. It's not you're not exactly the same as a guru or spiritual guide. You're you. So you have to individuate. But people go through a lot of different tensions and emotional conflicts at this stage, and that's what I delve into. And also, it often is motivated by teachers' misbehavior. You know, you go, I can't put up with this anymore, and you say goodbye. So that stage is important for bringing closure to the relationship, to recognize what I gained, what I learned and absorbed, what I'm grateful for, but also how my needs are changing. Maybe I need a different teacher, maybe I need no teacher. And what I'm most interested in is that people get through this stage without feeling bruised and injured, that the separation brings closure and resolution, gratitude, but also the knowledge that maybe this has reached an end point. I have to move on. And stage 8 is called finding the teacher within. And I love this part of the process because we start finding our teacher in life. We find new teachers to teach us new things. Why should you only have one teacher for your whole life? You know, there are some people that will find a specific guru that is their main inspiration for life, but you may have other guides for other things. Like I needed this Hatha yoga teacher in 1979. He really helped me liberate myself through the body, as opposed to Siddha yoga meditation, which was not so much emphasizing that. And yoga itself, the practices become the teacher. The practices emanate their own light. So if you are practicing Hatha yoga, or if you are practicing meditation with great interest, that practice is self-liberating. And that's the ultimate teaching, is that we hold the keys to liberating our consciousness here and now. Through our next breath, we can be free. We can have a deep, serene mind. And we can create our own synthesis, our own way of practicing. So I like to practice meditation while walking in nature. I like to practice yoga while listening to music. Different things blend together for me. For me, sight reading music is a meditation practice. And I've evolved dream work as a yoga of the unconscious, unifying the personality.
And do you feel like that synthesis that you get is what kind of leads to the opportunity for the final stage then of teaching others, because it has been not only from a teacher, but then integrated into yourself and mixed in with all of these other things that allow the opportunity then to teach others?
Right. So the final stage is teaching others or sharing our knowledge gracefully. This can mean formally becoming a teacher of some spiritual discipline or way of life, or it could just mean influencing the people in our world, in our life, just through our daily contact with how we treat them, how we interact. It doesn't have to be an overt thing that we're good teachers, but it's that we convey our process, our involvement with a spiritual path in a way that may affect and influence and inspire others. And for those who actually become teachers, there are certain guidelines that, talk about the tests of character that teachers go through, and how, it's very hard to be completely upright and clear in all of one's dealings with students around everything, around money, power, sex, things like this. So teachers are being examined, and they have to work on their way, how they handle their human relationships, and how to avoid complications that will make the process more complicated for the students and for themselves. I mean, really, it's sad to see some very inspiring teachers who have gotten themselves in trouble by not continuing self-examination, how teachers can become arrogant. And so I give some examples of this. And then just to find the right principle of directing others spiritually, to help them find the connection to their own inner unconscious, their own inner spiritual flow, and to not be controlling and domineering in our demeanor. So I talk about being a teacher as a spiritual practice, as a very demanding path, but rewarding. So that's the idea in spiritual apprenticeship. It's two-way. Both people have to keep evolving for the process to be enlivening.
Well, I love that, and I love that it puts responsibility on both teacher and student alike, which is something that personally to me is also very important. So I think that's really a special way to look at it. Greg, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm certain that our listeners have gotten so much out of this. Where can they find out more about you, the work that you do, your books, and everything else?
Thank you for asking, Ashton. My websites are www.dawnmountain.com. That's DAWN, dawnmountain.com, and gregbogart.net. And there we will find a lot of information about my different books. In the Company of Sages was published by Intertraditions. It's available in print and Kindle editions. You can find it at all your online booksellers or direct from Intertraditions or Simon & Schuster, Amazon, Powell's, BarnesandNoble.com. All of these carry this book. And I do like this text very much. There's a lot of myself in it. There's a lot of good stories and a lot of affirming of the path that we're on as seekers and trying to find the right guidance and how we can work this out and actually benefit from this eternal human tradition of transmission and awakening through spiritual friendship.
Excellent. Well, yes, I hope our listeners check out your book. I know I definitely enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening today. Dr. Greg Bogart, thank you so much for being on the show. I hope everyone has enjoyed our conversation today, and I hope you all have a very present moment. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.